I think the move story in a lot of ways is underknown because when it happened and the way that the politics and the media of the country were and maybe still are, I think they did not have the capacity to deal with a story that had this much complexity and had race so centrally in it, but in such a complicated way.
May 13, 1985, years of conflict between the city of Philadelphia and a small urban group known as MOVE ended in a violent day-long encounter.
Yeah, so my film is called Let the Fire Burn, and it's a story of the 1985 MOVE tragedy in Philadelphia, where a group calling itself MOVE that had been in conflict with the city and the city authorities for over 10 years, this came to its penultimate conflict and turned very violent. The police used over 10,000 rounds of ammunition and ultimately dropped explosives on the roof of a rowhouse where this group MOVE was barricaded in and had fortified their home. The result was the death of 11 people, 5 children and 6 adults, and one of the largest fires in the city's history that burned down 3 city blocks. So the film deals with that history, and it deals with it purely through the archival record. There's no talking heads or narration. It's purely a pastiche of all of the media coverage, and in particular the hearings that were held by a commission in Philadelphia 5 months later.
We intend to seize control of the house. We will do it by any means necessary.
Every one of us knew that someone was going to die.
Did you have a concern that the people inside that house might be in physical danger?
Excuse me, to
Yes, ma'am?
ask me what were we concerned is complete insanity.
The national black leadership had a lot of trouble with this. Wilson Goode was much more in keeping with the image they were putting forward. MOVE was very much not keeping with the image of what they were putting forward. And a lot of the sort of figures, specific political figures that you would expect to sort of come and stir the pot and keep it active in the media, didn't do that, didn't want to support MOVE, I think, largely. Jesse Jackson came to Philadelphia and he came to stand in solidarity with Wilson Goode. He came and stood on the platform at the press conference. And I think that's sort of telling about why it sort of went away. And then why don't people talk? I don't know, I just think it's difficult. I think people are really conflicted about it. And I think when you have something that doesn't fit into categories, it doesn't fit neatly into the things that make people understand and therefore feel better about it. Yeah, it's easier not to discuss it. I was growing up in Philadelphia and I was 11 years old when the MOVE fire happened, and I lived just outside the city, went to school near Conshohocken, and I think it was obviously a very tragic event, very traumatic for a lot of people in the city, the people it touched directly, and the city as a whole. It was a public tragedy in a lot of ways. But as a child, I think timing-wise, it affected me in a certain way because it was the first event. Sort of, you grow up and you have, if you're lucky enough, privileged enough to have a childhood in a traditional way, it's you're protected, you're sheltered by your parents. And then something comes along that breaks that shell, that is from the outside world and affects you. And for me, it was MOVE. I teach college students, and I think a whole generation that happened at 9/11. And for my parents, it's, I always remember where I was when I heard JFK died. But for me, I remember the smoke and the television coverage. And it's interesting, I've been talking to people and, how was it presented to you? Or what do you remember? What did adults tell you? And to be honest, even at that age, I think adults didn't actually know what to say. It was one of those things that I think that you read that as a kid, right? When the adults don't actually know how to explain it to you. And that's kind of how I remember it. We found footage for the film in a lot of different places, but the majority of it, the biggest single cache, was at Temple University's Urban Archive, and it came from the commission, actually. So it was the commission materials, including live television footage that the commission collected as evidence. And so all of that it's a little more complicated, but most of that was all ceded to Temple. And actually, I worked with Temple over almost 10 years, gaining access to this. And over that time, we identified together things that were missing from their collection, and I helped facilitate getting more pieces of it because there's more there than what I used in the film, and I believe there's a value in the mass of it being collected somewhere and being accessible to the public. You referenced the other work that's been done in the past, and I think my film is comprehensive when it deals with 1985, but in fact there's many pieces to this story, there's many puzzle pieces, and the Zinn piece focuses on 78 more, which is valid and an interesting story, and the Louis Messiah piece really puts it in context of black history in the city of Philadelphia, which I think is also hugely important. And neither one of those things, to a certain extent, 78, my film does some of, but in terms of that deeper history and context, my film largely ignores that. to focus on 1985. So I think it's great. I think there's a lot of room to tell stories about this, and I'm sort of hopeful that other work like that gets revived maybe through this film. In terms of me and my development, you really try to boil something down when you make a film and figure out, what is the most meaningful thing about it, and what does it mean to you, and how do you deliver that to an audience? And I guess ultimately for me, as I tried to digest it, the story really just presents a question of how does the unthinkable come to be reality. If you tell someone who's not familiar, 11 people are killed when the police drop a bomb and let the fire burn. It's just, it doesn't compute. They look at you odd and they say, wait, tell me that again. I don't understand. And I think it just presents one of those situations in such relief. And then I actually think in my interpretation and what I try to do with the film, it actually presents a partial answer to the question, which is about sort of dehumanizing people. The part of the answer is the unthinkable becomes possible when we look upon a fellow human and don't see a human being, right? Don't see that first, see a category between. And so I think that's, I don't know what I learned. I mean, it was more like there were all these candidates for how, what it was about and what it meant, and police brutality and militarization and racism and all of these, what is the central thing that you bring out? And to me, ultimately, it was that idea of the unthinkable and dehumanizing people when you see them as a category. I guess ultimately, to me, again, it's a film about how the unthinkable comes to happen and how people are dehumanized. And I think, part of that is when the children are killed too, that's a real mark of that sort of genocidal, dehumanizing violence, when violence is done to people with no regard for their humanity. And I guess I hope people look around the world and ask the question critically, where does this continue to happen in our world today? Where are people dehumanized? Where is violence done to them with no regard for their humanity? Where are children sacrificed for the agendas and beliefs of adults? And I hope, it's not a simple film where you go out and you sort of give money to a cause, or you make a new pledge to recycle or eat dolphin-safe tuna or whatever. It's a little more complicated than that. You have to digest it. You have to sort of deal with it, and in doing that, hopefully take a more critical view of a lot of things in the world. That's my hope. Maybe that's a little high-minded, but that's my hope.
The fire got real heavy, and we couldn't breathe. Then that's when we started yelling.
What did you say? What did you yell?
We want to come out.
There's no one that I know in city government that would intentionally go out there to burn those people to death. There's no one that I know of could do that.
I remember as soon as I scooped him up, he said to me, "Don't shoot me, don't shoot me."
Hi, I'm Jason Osder, director of Let the Fire Burn, and you're watching Reelblack.